There's a deep dive right now between HSI, IRS, and FBI. We know there's organized groups. We know there's funding. And we're doing a deep dive right now to identify them, follow the money, and find out who's organized this, who's inciting the violence.
4:26 a.m. The city hadn't woken yet, but something already knew they were coming. The first impact didn't sound like gunfire. It sounded like pressure. A dull, inward collapse that traveled through the chassis of the lead SUV before the windshield even cracked. The engine seized instantly. Metal screamed. The vehicle veered hard left, slammed the curb, and died without ever fully stopping. By the time the noise reached human ears, the operation was already compromised. North Minneapolis sat under a low winter sky, clouded and colorless. The temperature read 9 degrees Fahrenheit. Streetlights buzzed weakly, casting long shadows across snow-stained sidewalks and boarded storefronts. No traffic, no pedestrians, no witnesses who would admit they'd seen anything. 5 unmarked vehicles moved in sequence down a service corridor flanked by abandoned warehouses and narrow residential alleys. The route had been selected for speed and discretion. It was not on civilian navigation systems. It wasn't supposed to matter. Inside the convoy were 11 federal agents. This was classified as a low-friction administrative arrest. No warrants expected to be contested. No tactical stack. No forced entry. The target, a logistics intermediary tied loosely to an immigration documentation ring, had no violent record. No firearm purchases. No flagged associates. The briefing had lasted 9 minutes. At 4:24 a.m., the convoy crossed Fremont Avenue. At 4:26, the corridor sealed. The second round punched through the rear vehicle's side panel and detonated inside the cabin, shredding electronics and spraying insulation across the seats like snow. The third round followed before the echo faded. Then the fourth. Then silence. Brief, deliberate, controlled. This wasn't panic fire. It wasn't suppression. It was cadence. The radio crackled once. "Contact! Contact! We're—" The transmission cut mid-syllable. The antenna tore free, skidding across the road in sparks. Inside the remaining vehicles, displays flickered. GPS froze. Blue icons vanished from the shared tactical map one by one. From above, muzzle flashes appeared along the warehouse roofs. Not randomly, not searching. Each flash lasted less than a second, timed so that no two appeared together. Below, figures stepped out from alley mouths already crouched, already aiming, already moving again before return fire could find them. A heavier weapon joined in. Its sound wasn't sharp. It was mechanical. Deep. Repetitive. The kind of sound that doesn't announce itself so much as insist. Concrete chipped. Brick dust rained down. A parked delivery van absorbed 3 rounds and folded inward like paper. This wasn't an ambush. It was a sequence. Agents bailed out on instinct. Training overrode shock. Doors opened. Weapons came up. Knees hit frozen asphalt. Breath fogged instantly, giving away positions even before movement did. Return fire erupted into darkness that gave nothing back. Targets appeared, fired, vanished. Always from elevation. Always from angles that collapsed escape routes instead of advancing positions. Every attempt to maneuver was met with immediate correction. Fire shifted, lanes closed, cover became exposure. Then, the ground detonated. A shaped charge tore through the undercarriage of the third SUV. The blast wasn't loud, it was focused, surgical. Fuel lines ruptured, suspension collapsed. Flames spilled out low and flat, licking across the pavement without rising. An agent inside screamed once, then nothing. "Fall back!" someone shouted. There was nowhere to fall back to. Both ends of the corridor were blocked. Vehicles that hadn't been there an hour earlier now sat at deliberate angles. Doors open, hoods raised, positioned not to stop movement, but to slow it just enough to kill anyone who tried. Construction debris formed chest-high barriers along the side alleys. Fresh. Too fresh. Above it all, something hummed. Not loud, not threatening, just present. A drone hovered above the street line, barely visible against the clouds. Its infrared sensors swept slowly, calmly, mapping heat signatures that were already moving exactly as expected. That was the moment the realization landed. These weren't local crews reacting to enforcement. These weren't corner gangs defending territory. The fire discipline was too clean, the timing too precise. The kill zones overlapped like a diagram pulled straight from a training manual. Someone had studied federal movement patterns. Someone had tracked this team. Someone had known the route, the timing, the number of vehicles, and the absence of armor. The fourth SUV attempted to reverse. A metal spike punched through the front tire. Then another. The vehicle fishtailed, slammed into a utility pole, and stalled. Before the driver could reach for the door handle, automatic fire stitched across the hood, pinning everyone inside. Minutes stretched into something else entirely. Measured in heartbeats, measured in magazines, measured in how long it took blood to freeze on concrete. One agent dragged himself behind a dumpster, leaving a dark trail that crystallized almost immediately. Another lunged toward a downed teammate and was yanked back by his vest as a round shattered the curb where his head had been a second earlier. "Who the hell are these people?" someone yelled. No one answered, because the answer was forming in real time. This wasn't a street-level organization. This wasn't spontaneous violence. This was a coordinated strike by a Somali-linked criminal structure operating inside U.S. territory with military-grade discipline and live intelligence support. The convoy had never been the hunters. They were the bait. At 4:34 a.m., the firing slowed. Not because the attackers were retreating, because the objective had been met. Smoke drifted upward into the cold air. Sirens wailed in the distance, still minutes away. The drone lingered just long enough to record the aftermath. Disabled vehicles, scattered heat signatures, unmoving bodies on frozen pavement. Then it rose smoothly and disappeared. On the ground, 3 agents lay motionless. 2 more would never walk the same again. And somewhere far from the street, beyond the rooftops and the flashing lights, phones were already lighting up. Messages moving. Orders acknowledged. Funds shifting. The ambush was over. The war had just announced itself, when the street started talking. By 5:08 a.m., the street no longer belonged to the attackers or the agents. It belonged to evidence. Blue strobes washed over twisted metal and shattered glass as Minneapolis PD sealed the perimeter. The air smelled like burned fuel and frozen concrete. Paramedics moved quickly but spoke little. Their breath fogged the darkness as they worked bodies that no longer required urgency. Federal supervisors arrived without sirens. They didn't rush. They didn't ask questions out loud. Their faces already carried the look of people calculating how much of the truth could survive daylight. The official incident log would later label this an unexpected armed encounter during a routine enforcement action. No one who stood on that street used those words. They called it a kill corridor. Ballistics teams moved methodically, planting yellow markers wherever steel had met concrete. There were too many to count easily. Impacts riddled walls, dumpsters, vehicles, even second-story window frames. The pattern emerged before the last casing was logged. Fire had come from no fewer than 8 elevated positions. Angles overlapped. Blind spots didn't exist. Every likely movement path had been pre-covered. Attempts to flank would have been suicidal. Attempts to advance had already failed. Someone had rehearsed this street. Inside the surviving vehicles, technicians made the discovery that ended any remaining doubt. Communications hadn't gone dead randomly. They had been surgically silenced. Civilian bands were untouched. Emergency channels were clean. Local PD frequencies worked flawlessly. Only federal tactical bands had been jammed. That required doctrine-level knowledge, not just of equipment, but of how agencies coordinated under pressure. This wasn't interference. It was selective denial. At 5:41 a.m., analysts recovered footage from a drone that had crashed near the southern barricade. The attackers hadn't retrieved it. They didn't need to. The feed told the story clearly. The convoy entered the corridor. The first shot landed within 300 milliseconds of the lead vehicle crossing a specific GPS coordinate. Muzzle flashes bloomed in 3 separate locations, less than half a second apart. That timing wasn't coincidence. It was command and control. The footage revealed something else: movement before the convoy arrived. Shadows shifting into position. Heat signatures already aligned. The ambush hadn't reacted to the convoy. It had awaited it. At 6:12 a.m., the original assumption collapsed completely. This wasn't a gang defending territory. Gangs didn't deploy shaped charges calibrated to disable vehicles without drawing attention. They didn't use drones with thermal masking profiles. They didn't coordinate layered fire with escape denial built into the environment. This wasn't chaos. It was structure. At 6:49 a.m., federal intelligence cells began pulling threads that had been ignored for years. Surveillance anomalies that had never triggered alarms. Informant networks that had gone quiet without explanation. License plates that appeared near sensitive operations and then vanished from databases within hours. Individually, they meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern. By 7:22 a.m., analysts realized the ambush corridor wasn't random. It sat at the center of a logistics spine stretching across 3 states: warehouses, shipping fronts, nonprofit offices, and community organizations that shared addresses, board members, or financial service providers. The same names surfaced again and again, never in control, never visible, always adjacent. At 7:58 a.m., a forensic accountant flagged the first hard anomaly. A wire transfer routed through a Somali-owned freight brokerage cleared 12 minutes before the ambush began. The memo line was a single word: security. 30 seconds later, another transfer cleared. Then another. Then silence. The money hadn't paid for weapons. That was the mistake everyone made at first. Weapons were cheap. Weapons were everywhere. The money had paid for knowledge, routes, schedules, which teams skipped armored vehicles to avoid attention, which supervisors signed off on low-risk pickups to keep metrics clean. This ambush hadn't been designed to send a message. It had been designed to measure a response. At 9:03 a.m., analysts noticed something that shut the room down. Social media activity tied to several suspected coordinators spiked immediately after the shooting, then vanished entirely. Phones powered off, accounts wiped, devices abandoned in public places miles apart. They weren't celebrating. They were timing. How fast did the perimeter lock? Which agencies arrived first? When did air assets get requested? Did command hesitate or escalate? The attackers weren't afraid of retaliation. They were mapping it. By mid-morning, internal briefings changed tone. Words like incident and engagement disappeared. They were replaced by terms no one wanted associated with domestic enforcement. Insurgency, networked cells, foreign-aligned criminal governance. At 10:41 a.m., one recovered rifle closed the argument completely. It wasn't American surplus. It wasn't stolen from local inventory. Its serial had been destroyed, but its internal components traced back to overseas production runs tied to active conflict zones. This weapon hadn't drifted into Minneapolis. It had been delivered. At 11:19 a.m., a secure call reached federal leadership. The briefing was short, clinical, almost understated. This was no longer an immigration enforcement issue. This was a transnational criminal structure operating inside U.S. borders, capable of precision attacks against federal agents, funded deeply enough to absorb losses, disciplined tightly enough to execute complex operations without leaks. The ambush hadn't been meant to stop enforcement. It had been meant to prove it could be stopped. And that realization carried more weight than the bodies on frozen asphalt. Follow the money. Find the system. By early afternoon, the investigation stopped chasing shooters. It started chasing gravity. Every operation leaves a financial shadow. Most are faint. This one wasn't. It spread outward in every direction, touching entities that had never been examined together because no one had ever thought to look at them as a single organism. Shell companies appeared first, trucking firms with no trucks, janitorial services billing industrial contracts they couldn't possibly staff, import-export brokers moving volumes that dwarfed their declared infrastructure, community nonprofits listed as cultural outreach groups quietly receiving federal grants year after year without audits that went deeper than surface compliance. Individually, they were forgettable. Together, they moved billions. Funds entered legally through grants, reimbursements, small business incentives, housing programs, shipping credits. The money bounced through regional banks, fragmented into amounts just under reporting thresholds, then recombined offshore through jurisdictions designed not to hide money, but to delay questions. From there, the capital didn't disappear. It came back refined, encrypted radios, thermal optics, commercial drones modified for persistence and redundancy. Vehicles reinforced just enough to survive initial contact without triggering alarms. This wasn't a cartel that stumbled into violence. It was a cartel that invested in it. At 1:18 p.m., analysts reconstructed the pipeline backward. Immigration fraud wasn't the objective. It was the camouflage. The real business was control. Migrants weren't simply transported. They were cataloged, debts tracked, leverage stored, names cross-referenced with relatives, employers, landlords, every dependency mapped. Those who couldn't pay worked. Those who resisted disappeared. The organization didn't need to terrorize entire neighborhoods. Fear scaled efficiently when applied surgically. A landlord who asked questions. A driver who spoke too freely. A relative who forgot where loyalty was supposed to live. The ambush fit cleanly into that model. The information hadn't come from one leak. It never does. It came from accumulation, small disclosures across time, a schedule mentioned casually, a route assumed to be routine, a supervisor known to avoid armored support because it changed the tone. No single betrayal, just a network that listened. At 2:37 p.m., investigators recovered a hard drive from a seized office space listed as a tax preparation service. Inside were operational files that removed any remaining ambiguity. They weren't plans. They were models. Heat maps of federal activity across the metro area, updated weekly. FBI task forces, local partnerships, federal enforcement units, each color-coded by response time, equipment profile, and political sensitivity. Certain units were marked in green, low escalation risk. Those units had been targeted. The ambush wasn't retaliation, it was a demonstration. Violence wasn't chaos. Violence was policy. By late afternoon, communications intercepts revealed another layer. The cartel wasn't isolated, it wasn't hierarchical either. It operated as a marketplace. Weapons expertise contracted from one group, document forgery sourced from another, chemical precursors routed through a third, transport specialists rotated as needed. No alliances, no loyalty, just transactions. Each cell was replaceable. That was the point. At 4:56 p.m., federal leadership stopped framing the problem as something that could be arrested away. This wasn't law enforcement versus criminals. This was an ecosystem that understood how American systems worked, how oversight lagged, how accountability diffused, how compassion could be exploited without triggering alarms. The network didn't hide from the system. It lived inside its blind spots. Then came the shift. Financial analysts flagged unusual behavior. Accounts tied to the network weren't fleeing. They were consolidating. Capital was moving into assets that couldn't be frozen easily. Commodities, cash, people. They weren't panicking. They were preparing. At 6:21 p.m., a senior analyst summarized the situation in a sentence that would be repeated quietly across briefing rooms that night. This isn't organized crime adapting to enforcement. This is governance competing with the state. Outside, the city moved on. Traffic returned. Stores reopened. Online arguments ignited over headlines that hadn't even been written yet. But beneath that normalcy, the ground had shifted. The ambush had proven something irreversible. There was an armed network operating in plain sight, capable of intelligence collection, coordinated violence, and rapid regeneration. And it had crossed a line meant to be uncrossable. The next move wouldn't be theirs, but it wouldn't be gentle either. The order that bypassed optics. The directive didn't arrive with ceremony, no conference call, no talking points, no warnings to manage headlines. It came at 9:03 p.m., pushed through a secure channel that bypassed every procedural layer designed to slow decisions down. The language was spare, almost cold. Authorized full-spectrum disruption, no press coordination, no advance notice to local officials, no restriction on scope. What followed wasn't a raid. It was a systems failure, engineered. At 9:17 p.m., financial institutions across 3 states received emergency freeze notices tied to a list of accounts that had never appeared together before. Not because they were hidden, but because no one had ever thought to view them as a single organism. Within seconds, transactions failed mid-transfer. Automated systems flagged anomalies faster than human compliance teams could process them. Funds stalled in digital limbo, neither cleared nor returned. The network felt it immediately. Phones lit up. Couriers rerouted. Safe houses activated protocols that had only ever existed on paper. Some cells moved too early. Others waited too long. Both mistakes were fatal. By 10:04 p.m., the first physical nodes were hit. Not the storefronts. Not the offices meant to burn. They targeted the connective tissue, storage facilities that officially stored nothing but consumed industrial levels of electricity. Residential properties listed as vacant, yet emitting constant encrypted traffic every night. Warehouses with no inventory but abnormal cooling signatures. Doors came down fast. Inside, agents didn't find chaos. They found order. Whiteboards covered in flow diagrams, laptops running custom financial routing software, radios tuned to frequencies no civilian system should have known existed. In one location, a room glowed with monitors, live feeds pulled from city cameras, private security systems, traffic sensors. Someone had been watching the city breathe in real time. By 11:38 p.m., resistance emerged. Not gunfire, not desperation, counter-moves. Accounts reactivated under new identities, vehicles abandoned with engines still warm. Data wiped remotely as teams advanced down hallways. In 2 locations, fires were set, not to destroy evidence, but to force responders into predictable patterns. Evacuation routes, hose lines, containment perimeters. The cartel wasn't trying to win. It was trying to survive intact. That's when analysts noticed the shift. Messages that had once flowed laterally, cell to cell, began converging. Not toward a leader, toward a processor. At 12:26 a.m., a single node lit up on the tracking grid. An inland industrial compound listed as a packaging facility. No complaints, no inspections, no enforcement history. But digitally, it pulsed like a heartbeat. By 1:41 a.m., the perimeter was sealed. No sirens, no announcements. The breach came without warning. Inside, the air was thick with heat and chemicals. Machinery ran continuously. Conveyor systems moved materials no one immediately recognized. Workers didn't look up when armed agents entered the room. Some didn't speak English. Some didn't speak at all. Identification was nearly impossible. Faces hollow, fingers scarred, documentation non-existent or recycled. This wasn't a command center. It was an engine. Ledgers recovered on site told the story in numbers that made even seasoned investigators pause. Revenue streams, expense ratios, loss tolerance. Human attrition modeled the same way corporations model supply chain risk. Violence wasn't ideology. It was a cost center. At 3:12 a.m., confirmation arrived. The individual believed to have authorized the ambush wasn't present. He never had been. He didn't need to be. The system had already learned how to operate without him. That was the most dangerous discovery of the night. You could arrest people. You could seize assets. But dismantling a structure that could replicate itself inside regulatory blind spots was something else entirely. By dawn, the city woke to headlines that tried to impose closure. Crackdown, major arrests, federal operation underway. Words that suggested an ending. There wasn't one. 3 agents were dead. Dozens were injured. And a transnational criminal system had revealed its true form. Not as infiltration, but as coexistence under false assumptions. The ambush hadn't been defiance. It had been a warning, a controlled demonstration designed to inject hesitation into every future operation. As investigators prepared the next wave of warrants, one question hung unspoken in every room. If this network could build itself quietly, fund itself legally, and strike federal agents with precision, how many others were already in place, waiting for the moment when routine turned into another trap? By 7:18 a.m., the street where the ambush had unfolded looked ordinary again. The burned vehicles were gone. The shell casings had been collected. The scorch marks were scrubbed just enough to stop drawing attention. Traffic flowed through the corridor by noon. People stepped around faint discolorations in the asphalt without slowing down. A delivery truck parked where an agent had bled out hours earlier. Normal life reasserted itself the way it always does, efficiently, indifferently. Officially, the operation was ongoing. Unofficially, everyone understood the truth. The collapse had hurt the network, but it hadn't killed it. Financial seizures disrupted cash flow. Arrests removed key processors. Infrastructure had been exposed, cataloged, and degraded. But the core logic of the system, the model, remained intact. That was the part no press release could explain. You could dismantle a hierarchy. You could decapitate leadership. But this wasn't built like that. It was modular, adaptive, designed to shed losses and continue. By mid-morning, analysts began seeing signs of regeneration. Not dramatic, not aggressive, subtle. New shell entities registering under different jurisdictions. Funds rerouted through unrelated industries. Communications resuming at reduced bandwidth, slower, quieter, smarter. The system wasn't retreating, it was learning. At 10:46 a.m., a senior briefing circulated internally. It avoided names, it avoided predictions. It focused on one conclusion that no one wanted to say out loud. The ambush had succeeded. Not tactically, but strategically. It had forced a recalculation. Supervisors would hesitate before approving unarmored operations. Routes would be second-guessed. Routine would stop meaning what it used to mean. Fear didn't need to be widespread. It only needed to be precise. The agents who survived didn't talk to reporters. Some didn't talk at all. They carried images that wouldn't fade, angles of fire that shouldn't have existed, movements that felt rehearsed before they happened. They knew something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't law enforcement confronting crime. This was the state realizing it shared space with a parallel system, one that collected intelligence, allocated resources, enforced discipline, and applied violence selectively, efficiently, without spectacle. That night, long after the cameras were gone, one of the analysts who had worked the financial maps stayed behind. He stared at a screen filled with nodes that no longer pulsed, but hadn't disappeared either. He didn't say much, just one sentence, spoken quietly enough that it never made it into any report. We didn't uncover this. They let us see it. Because that was the final, uncomfortable truth. The ambush wasn't an act of desperation. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't even a challenge. It was a demonstration, a controlled reveal of capability, meant to show what could happen, not what would happen every time. The message wasn't sent to the public. It was sent to the system itself, and the system received it. By evening, the city lights came on again. Snow fell softly over rooftops and sidewalks. Somewhere, meetings were held, policies adjusted, language softened, risk recalculated. The machinery did what it always does best. It forgot just enough. And in that forgetting, in the space between memory and denial, the conditions that allowed the ambush to happen quietly reassembled themselves, waiting patiently for the next moment when routine would once again feel safe. Until it wasn't.